Right, so I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you now see the Excel workbook that looks like the one that's on your screen as well. So just a quick overview of what we have in this workbook. We have this first tab, and if you were in the intermediate class, you heard Jen explain that we always have kind of a working tab, and this is the data that we're actually working with and adjusting. So we have that. And then colored in this orange or salmony color, we have our raw data, our original data, and we have 3 of those tabs. And then here in these light blue tabs, we have information that we'll actually be building out at the second half of the class today. And they're currently blank or just have kind of headers or indicators. But these dark blue tabs are kind of the answer guide, seeing behind the curtain. So if there is something that you want to come back and reference, or when we're talking about pivot tables and you missed one thing and you're going to build it later, you can go into these example pages and you'll see exactly what we did. So hopefully those are helpful, maybe today, but definitely afterwards as reference points. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, if you click around on this worksheet, you'll probably notice that it does not allow you to edit any of the information. And this means that it's locked down, most likely. So sometimes you'll receive a workbook that's locked and just, you'll have to get the password for it. This also is to show you how wonderful being able to lock can be when you're sending data or information to someone else and you want them to be able to see it, but not necessarily edit it. So you can see how powerful the locked option is. It truly locks things down. But since we do want to be using our data today, if you'll navigate to these, we call these ribbons up above. Some people more colloquially will say tabs, but I will navigate over to the review ribbon. If you click there, you'll see this section here that says protect. So if you click unprotect sheet, it's going to ask you what the password of your sheet is. You'll see that it is very important to remember your password because it's not going to give you any information or hints or anything like that. Luckily, yesterday I was freaking out because I was like, what's my password? I tried Excel, written with capital, not capital. And luckily I wrote it on our participant guide. So just a note, definitely write it down somewhere that you're not going to lose. And our password here is lock. So if you'll just write lock and say okay. And now as you click around, you'll notice that it actually lets you click into the cells, whether those cells are, equations or not. You have access to all the cells now. I do want to just quickly show you how to lock things down in a kind of real life situation where I've used it. When maybe, let's say you have a spreadsheet or data that you've pulled and most of the information is correct. You don't want it to be messed up, but you do see that there are some birth dates, for example, that are wrong. So if we go to column F and I have it sorted already, sorted oldest to newest, we'll see that we have in this spreadsheet 4 birth dates that are 1/1/1990, 1900. A lot of databases use this as like if it's blank. And those are obviously incorrect. And maybe I want to send it to the clinician that actually has these clients' birth dates. So what I'm going to do first is maybe I'll highlight these 4 cells. So I'm going to just click and drag over them, go to my home ribbon tab, and in the middle there's this paint bucket, and I'm just going to choose a color for them. So I'm choosing light yellow. And then what I want to do is actually format all of the cells. So I'm going to click in the corner of my data sheet between the A and the 1. And there's that little kind of arrow. And if I click that, I select all of my cells. And then I'm going to right click and go down to where it says format cells. So I selected all my data, I right clicked, and now I'm going to click format cells. And this box pops up and has the last tab of the formatting cells says protection. So I'm going to navigate over to protection and I'm going to click where it says locked. What that does is it doesn't lock the cells immediately. I can only lock the cells when I actually protect the sheet. But as you'll see it written below here, it says locking cells or hiding formulas has no effect until you protect the worksheet. So what I'm saying is when I protect it, I want these cells to actually be locked. So I've selected all of my cells, I've pushed locked, and now I'm going to say okay. And now with those 4 cells that I do not want locked because I want to send this to my colleague and I want them to change the birth dates if they're correct, I want to unlock those cells. So I'm going to select these 4 cells. So from F2 to F5, where I have those highlighted birth dates. And doing the same process, I'm going to right click again. I'm going to go to Format Cells again, go to the Protection tab again. And now I'm going to, where it says locked, I'm going to uncheck that box. And now I say okay. So now what I've done on my spreadsheet is I've told it when I protect this sheet, I want it to lock all of the cells except those 4 that I unlocked. And so I'd love to just look at that with you. So if you go again to the review ribbon and then to protect sheet, and now it's going to ask me the password to protect the sheet or to unprotect it once it's protected. I do want to just make a note because I'm not going to delve deep into these different items, but you'll see in the list here below that there are a lot of different options for what users can do with the worksheet when it's locked. So you may want to lock it down, but still allow users to insert columns or rows, something like that. And you can select such that they can do that. Right now, we're allowing users to still select. So that means just like when you first opened it, click on the cells. They can't edit the information, but they can click on them. Okay, and now I'm just going to put the password lock, L-O-C-K. Okay, and this is a really useful feature. It does ask you to type it twice. So if you have a typo, hopefully it'll catch it. And so put lock again. Okay. And now I've protected my sheet. So now if you click around, you'll hopefully get the same message that I am. It's not allowing me to click to really change any of the information, but I can change these birthdays. So maybe this grandparent's birthday was actually 1/1/1930. Enter. And as you'll see, I was able to change the birth date and the formula still worked, right? It's locked, but it's still operating under there. So it changed this grandparent's birth date to, age to 90. So the formula still calculated from the birth date I just changed. All right, now if you'll just go ahead and unprotect the sheet again. So again, review ribbon, unprotect sheet, ask me a password. I'm going to put in lock and say okay. And maybe for those of you who have cameras, if you do have it successfully unlocked, if you can give me a thumbs up because it'll be difficult to do anything else if the worksheet is not unlocked. All right, thank you. Awesome. So now we're going to dig into some formulas. And I think that this is where really the data analysis starts getting more powerful. I also say more powerful, like it will save you a lot of time and energy. And what we're going to use is the Vlookup equation. And what the Vlookup equation does is essentially in so many occasions when you're downloading data or maybe even entering data, you'll have different tabs with the same clients. So like I have a demographics page and I have my 25 clients there. And then I'll have, and the examples we're giving are, for example, an assessment score, like an ASQ3 score. And we want to tie that data together. So we want to be able to look at, how many people completed their ASQ by gender, by zip code, right? That's always what funders are asking for. That's also probably interesting information for you all to see to start really analyzing your data. So that's why we use the Vlookup equation, is to be able to kind of tie or connect our data together. So I'm on the working tab here, and I'm going to create a new column at the end where I'm going to pull my data into, because this is where my working tab is where I'm pulling all of my data into. And I'm going to name it ASQ date. So I'm just going to literally type in W1 ASQ date, and then click enter. I chose to add it at the end because I think it's helpful to show just a couple of little tips. So when I'm doing this, I'm noticing, first of all, it's not green, and I want it to be green like my other columns. It also doesn't have the filters on, so it's not connected to the rest of the data. So just quickly, to get this to turn green in the exact same green that I have on all of my other columns, I'm going to go to a column that I like, the color that I want to copy over, then to my home ribbon, and click the format painter. What that's doing is it's kind of taking up the formatting of the source, right, where I want to copy that, and then I get to paint it somewhere else. So I'm going to click cell V1, click format painter, and then, because you'll see that I selected the formatting, you see that little, people call it ants, I guess, around the cell. And then click on cell W1, and I've copied the formatting over. The second thing I want to do is put the filters on this column as well. And so I have cell W1 selected. I'm going to click where it says sort and filter. And then I'll see that there's the filter button is selected. I'm going to click that. And that actually removes all the filters. And then I'm going to go right back to the exact same place, to that drop down. And I'm going to click filter again, and it magically puts them all back on. Or not so magically, I think we did it. Cool, so now we have the column all set up for where we want to bring the ASQ dates in. Now we want to kind of prepare our source data, so the ASQ3 tab. What this equation, the Vlookup equation, is going to do is it is going to find, again, that exact same client on the ASQ page. So we're starting on the demographic page. It has the client selected on the demographic page. It goes over to the ASQ page and it looks for that exact same client. The way that we can determine if it's the exact same client is obviously has to be some sort of connecting value. So you need to have some information that is the exact same on both of the tabs. If it's, I don't suggest using, for example, a name, because maybe there's going to be a blank space after the name, or two people with the same name, or, you know, there's a lot of kind of possibilities for error or duplication there. Usually what we use is some sort of ID. Again, with ID, if you're manually clicking it in, just make sure you don't do like 101 space, because that's a different entry than just 101, for example. But usually when it's computer generated, it's going to come out, right? And otherwise, you just got to be careful. So in this case, the ID values that we have two options, case ID and individual ID. Individual ID, as the name indicates, is individual, is unique for each individual. Whereas case ID, you'll see that, for example, these two people have the same case ID. That's because it's a family ID. It ties together the family. So probably for ASQs, what I'm going to want to use as my connector value is this individual ID. Cool, so I've established that. That's my unique value. And now I need to go look in the ASQ3 tab for, okay, do I have that same connecting value? Because again, we need something to connect them so the computer knows to connect them. And what do you know? Indeed we do. This has an individual ID. So the thing though is that the computer doesn't know what if we're saying this is ASQs from 2020 and someone completed the ASQ twice in the same year. You have to decide, do I want the computer to give me the date for the most recent one completed or the first one completed in the year? Because the computer isn't going to give you both dates. It's going to go down, starting at the top, look down the column, and it's going to find the first time it sees that ID, and it's going to give you the information back on that line. So actually, this is a great example. Right here, I see this client did complete the ASQ twice in November. Nope, that's actually October, and in February. So in this case, if I want it to be the first time in the year, I right click where it says ASQ date, and then I go to sort, and I'm going to do A to Z. or like it's basically the same as oldest to newest. And so now I've sorted it so the dates furthest back come first. So when I'm doing my Vlookup equation, it's going to hit the oldest date first. Cool. So now I've done the pre-work. The pre-work included setting up where the data was going to go into. It included finding my connector value and looking at the data I'm going to be pulling from and making sure that it's sorted in the way I want it to be. Now we're ready to start writing the equation. So I'm going to go back to my working tab, going back to that ASQ date column, and I'm going to start writing. So I start with equals for an equation, and I'm sure you've all written some equations before, but the beautiful thing is you can just start typing VL and it pops up for me. And it even gives me a description of what this equation does in case I'm sure. I know that I want the VLOOKUP, so I'm actually just going to double click where it says VLOOKUP, and it continues writing it for me. Just as a note, it doesn't matter if it's capitalized or not. Excel reads it the same. And you'll notice that it says VLOOKUP and then it starts with a parentheses. So the other thing that Excel does, which is a really helpful thing, it's probably very tiny for you all, so you can look on your own screens, but it gives me actually step by step what this equation needs in order to be successful. So the first thing it asks me for is the lookup value. This is the same thing as the connector value, right? Like what is it going to look up on the other sheet when it's looking for the information we want it to give us? So in this case, our lookup value is individual ID. So I'll scroll over and just click on cell D2, which is our individual ID. And then I'm going to click back up here in the formula bar and put a comma, because once we're done with that section, we put a comma to separate it. And now it's asking me for the table array. So that means, okay, cool, I'm going to look up this value, the individual ID, but where am I going to look? Where is my table that I'm going to look in? And the most important thing to note in this is that whatever you select as the first column of this table array has to be that same lookup value. That's where it's going to look for the connector value. So I'm going to click over to ASQ3, and I need to select the column that has that same connector value. So I'm going to actually click on the letter D up above here. And that's where I'm starting. But I want to give it the whole array. So I need to at least click and drag to the ASQ date, because that's the information I'm looking for. If I want to, I can scroll all the way over to, column Q. That's whatever. But I need to at least in the table array include whatever value I'm looking for. So I'm going to click and drag. So start with column D, click and drag over to column J, which is where I have my ASQ date. And I want to note here that there's something that's going to become very useful for us in a second. You'll see that there's a little flag that comes out from my cursor that has a really huge number and then R and then 7C. The really huge number is how many rows are selected, which isn't that important for us. But the column number becomes super important in this equation. So I always, when I click and drag, I pay attention to that little flag to see what column I'm on, so I don't have to kind of hand count what column. And what that 7 means is that it's the 7th column from where we started. So not on the whole worksheet, it's just the 7th column from where we started. All right, cool. So I've finished. I'm just going to use that for my table array. Again, it's okay if I want to go like that, whatever. And then I put a comma in. So now it's asking me for the column index number, and that's what we just were talking about. It's going to ask me, what column number do you want me to return? What column number are you looking for the information in? And it's not overall, it's the column number from the first column in the table array. So in this case, because I just was paying attention when I clicked and drag, I know that that's 7. So I'm going to put the 7 there and then a comma. Then the last part it asks for true or false. I always use false. True is like an approximate match. Don't exactly know what that means, but maybe if you did like 104.1 instead of 104.2, it would give it back to you. I'm not quite sure, but basically there's no reason to use it because we want to make sure it's exactly the same. So I'm going to double click false and then end this quotation. Or sorry, end with a parentheses. And once we do that, we don't need to navigate back over to the working tab. It'll do that automatically once I just push enter. So I'm going to push enter. Hopefully you came up with this error message. It's a good sign, don't worry. Well, probably a good sign. I guess it could be a bad sign, but could also be a good sign. How are we doing there? Did we get the equation in? Cool. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I want this equation to go into the whole column. So if I go into this cell W2 and I put my cursor over the bottom right corner, you'll see this like little green dot, and my cursor, when it's over it, turns into a black cross. And so I'm going to double click there. And now the equation has filled in all the way to the bottom. You'll see that I have a lot of error messages, that little hashtag NA. And I also have a bunch of 5-digit codes. Those 5-digit codes are actually, well, I know that they're dates in another format. So they're like Excel's way of coding dates when you have it in a non-date format. So with all those cells selected, if you've clicked elsewhere and deselected these cells, just select the column or select the cells again. So I'm just going to select column W. And in the home ribbon tab, if you go to the middle where it says number, you'll see that there's a drop down, and that's for number formats. So I'm going to click on that drop down and click short date. And now hopefully, well, your errors are still going to stay errors, because what that meant is like I went and looked for that ID number and I didn't find it. So it gave you an error. But where it did find a date, it now is giving you back the information you're looking for in the correct format. All right. Good work up to here. Any VLOOKUP questions? All right. I'm not looking at the chat, but feel free to chat Audrey and she'll be able to respond. Great. So this is cool. It worked. We pulled in some information, but some of these error messages are kind of misleading because it makes it look like this client in this second row, row 2, the first client information, like should have had an ASQ but didn't. But if we scroll over and we look at relationship, this was actually a mother, and we know that the ASQs aren't for caregivers. So it looks like I had an error, or like I had a missing value, but I actually didn't. So how can I control for this? What if I only want the equation to work when the relationship says child? Because it's really only applicable when the relationship says child. So if I click again on cell W2, I'm going to actually add in on top of this kind of a condition using an if statement that says, hey, if the cell says, the relationship says child, awesome, do this equation. If not, I don't want you to run through the equation, just return a blank. So if I click between the equal sign and the VLOOKUP, I can start actually building this if equation on top of the one we've already done. So I'm going to click between the equal sign and where it starts saying VLOOKUP, and I am going to start writing if. So just if, and then a parentheses. And the first thing that comes up, again, because Excel is very helpful and it tells me what I need to do first, it says right up here, logical test. What's the logical test? In this case, it is, and I can literally, again, just click the cell E2, so relationship, equals child. And when you're using text in an Excel equation, you always need to put it in quotes. So I'm going to say if E2 equals, and then quote, child, end quote. Someone in our last class asked if it needs to be capitalized, and actually Excel is fine with if it's capitalized or not. It doesn't have to match in that way, but it will, you can't put an extra space or anything like that or misspell it. So if E2 equals, and then in quotes, child, and then I'm going to put a comma because I've already done my logical test. And then it says value if true. So if indeed E2 does equal child, what do you want me to do? And we know what, if it says child, we want it to go through that Vlookup equation and look for the ASQ date. So I'm good on value if true. I already know I want it to do the Vlookup equation. So I'm going to just click to the end of that Vlookup equation and then put a comma. And now it's asking me value if false. So if E2, if relationship does not equal child, what should I do? And in this case, I'm going to put just a dash in the cell. So again, it's kind of a text, a form of text. So I do a quote, dash, end quote, and then close the parentheses. And this I would say is a best practice. I mean, certainly there might be times when you would actually just want it to read blank. In that case, you would just put the beginning quote and the end quote and not put anything in between. But often you might not know that the equation exists underneath there. So I recommend usually, putting a dash so that you know something's happening underneath there and you're not like, whoops, I didn't put the equation in. Okay, cool, we're done with that. Ended the quote, and so I push enter. And hopefully you got a little dash in that first cell. And then again, using the process we did last time, you can put your cursor over the bottom right where there's that little dot and double click, and it'll fill in the equation to the bottom. And now if I scroll down, I'll see a lot of dashes because all the caregivers are on top. That's how it's sorted. And then I will start seeing a lot of dates. Awesome, those are probably all children, or they are all children. And then will be a couple of error values where it says, the hashtag NA. And those two are legitimate errors now because they are children, but children where when in our data set for ASQ3s, it didn't find any ASQ date. So we can trust our errors now. Awesome. So I wanted to show, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, before you go on, could you go over the formula one more time?
Yeah, the if or the VLOOKUP or the whole thing?
Yeah, I think it's adding the if portion and I think adding the dash for the false.
Okay, yep. I'm going to deconstruct, and then I'll do it again. All right, so we started with this VLOOKUP equation and all of its beautiful parts, our lookup number, right, value, table array, column index number. And now I want to add in that condition that says, okay, if it's a child, yeah, I want you to go do that VLOOKUP equation, but if it's not a child, don't do it. So I'm going to put my cursor on that VLOOKUP equation in between the equal sign and where VLOOKUP begins. And then I'm going to write if and my beginning parentheses, and it starts giving me indications of how to build this if formula. First, it says, what's your logical test? So what is our kind of condition? And in this case, our logical test is if E2, where it says relationship, and then equal sign, and then in quotes, I'm going to write child. So if the relationship equals child, and then I end quote, again, because it's text, I have to put that in a quote. So now we're done with our logical test. And again, when we're done with any segment, we put a comma. So it went from bolding where it said logical test, and now it's telling me the next thing I need to do, and it's bolding where it says value if true. And value if true, if it says child, we wanted to do that VLOOKUP equation that we already wrote. So I just get to leave that exactly as is. I'm going to click at the end of it and put another comma. Now it says value of false. If the relationship is not a child, what do you want me to do? And in this case, we are going to put a dash. And again, dash reads like text. So I'm going to put a beginning quote, a little dash, and an end quote. And it'll do whatever is in between those quotes. And then I put the last parentheses. And I have completed my equation and pushed enter. And now it's completed. And then I just did the same thing we did last time, went in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a little green dot. And I double clicked and it carried that equation into all of the cells. All right. We're going to do a little bit more practice on an if equation now. So hopefully if you weren't following that, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense in this next step. So I'm going to select column W and click. There's a couple of ways to do this. You can just click the insert button here, or there's a drop down in the home ribbon tab under cells, and I can say insert sheet columns. You'll notice that because we did it this way rather than what I had done before, it copied over the formatting and the filter and everything. I didn't just add it on the end. I said insert a sheet column. So that's usually what makes it easier. And this column we're going to name ASQ completed ? Or something to that effect. And for this one, basically I now have a column where I have like a bazillion dates, but I'm actually just interested, did they get it done or not in 2020? So I am going to write an equation that will just give me kind of a yes completed or it's missing. So again, it's going to be an if equation. So I'm going to start in W2 and put equals and then say if, and start the parentheses. And now I want to say if where it says ASQ date is an error, I want it to say missing, right? Because that's where we got the hashtag NA, like there was no date. So if I get an error as a return, I want to say that the ASQ is missing. And if not, I want to say, yes, it's completed. Because I don't care what the date is. I just want to know if I got a date back or not. So again, it's asking me for my logical test. In this case, we're going to write actually another, we're going to write the words is error. And then it asks me for the value, which is going to be x2. And then close the parentheses. So I'm saying my logical test is, it's like, I guess Yoda speak. It's like, if is error x2, if x2 is an error, and then I can, after that logical test, I put a comma. So I'm done with the logical test. And now value of true. What do I want to say if it's an error? Well, then ASQ missing. So I'm going to put a quote, write ASQ missing, or whatever you want to say, end quote. And then that's what I want to say if it's true. If it truly is an error, it's missing. And then put a comma and value of false. If it's not an error, what do you want me to say? Well, if it's not an error, if it's whatever date value, I want to say in quotes, yes, completed, end quote. And that was my last thing that I had to do in this equation, value of false, so that I can end with a parentheses for the whole thing and click enter. And then I'm going to, my equation worked. I'm going to go to the bottom right-hand corner again, do the double click. And as I scroll down, you'll see that it's filled in values for all the value for the whole column. And thankfully, where we did indeed have an error, where it did say hashtag NA, it says ASQ missing, which is great. That's what we wanted.
Abby, we have a quick question about whether a space matters, like if you put a space after a comma.
Yeah, it won't like that. Let me see. It just corrected it for me, I think. So it did it, but it just corrected. Let's see. I'm just trying it out. Oh, actually, it didn't. It doesn't seem to. It seems to be okay with these spaces. So, yeah. I mean, basically, like, yeah, it doesn't seem to be bothering. Like, if you do it after the comma. Okay, let me see. So this is great, the equation worked, but we know that it's not exactly sensical because we again have the issue where, you know, these are dashes now, they're not errors for these caregivers, and it's coming back as yes completed. So I want to not have that happen. So I could, again, write an if equation and, you know, gets a little more complex. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to show you another way. So if you go over to relationship again and hit the filter, you'll see that currently I have everyone selected. I'm going to click the box where it says child to deselect child. So now I'll only be seeing father, grandparent, mother. And I'm going to say, okay. And now as I scroll down, I notice that no children are showing anymore. Exactly what I wanted. And so now I'm going to scroll back to that original column where it says ASQ completed. I'm going to select all of the cells in that column. And now that I have all the cells selected, what I want to do is not delete the actual cells, because if I delete the cells, all the formatting will get wonky. Instead, I'm going just to right click and hit clear contents. And basically what that does is it kind of removes whatever is in the cells without you having to worry about formatting getting all weird. So clear contents. I don't need the formulas for these ones. Then I go back over to my relationship. I'm going to show the children again. Say okay. And now as I scroll down, you'll see that I still have that yes completed in where the client is a child, but not for caregivers.
And Abby, I think it's maybe a question outside of the scope of this class, but someone's asking, how would we create a different return value for the caregivers? I think that's a bit more of a complex equation, but maybe you could give an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if I were doing this, I would probably build another like if equation on top of this. I just, you know, you start doing a lot of layers. So we did that process here. So I would probably do the same thing we did with this equation here. So on top of this equation, I would build another if equation that said only if child, do that process, the if is heir, blah, blah, blah. And if it's not a child, I would do a dash. So I think if equations, you start just like we call them nested ifs, or not we, I think the people, the Excel. And you just nest if statements within if statements within if statements to get all of the kind of specificity that you want. The logic stays the same. So as you get comfortable doing just like one if equation, then you'll find yourself wanting to maybe do another, like someone just asked that question, do you want to do another one? And you'll be able to just kind of build out. Cool. So I want to show you one other equation, just because I think it's quite another thing that can be quite useful for doing counting for you. So if we go over to the ASQ3 tab, and I'm sure you all know the ASQ much more than I, but there's like several different sections in the ASQ, and each of them have the possibility of having a concern or delay. But often what for maybe reporting or things like that, you might be interested not in kind of how many clients overall have a concern in whatever category, but maybe the data comes out like it does in this case with just none are concerned and there's not like an overall category. Was there any concern for this client? So I want to create that. I'm going to break my golden rule of not editing your raw data. And I'm going to select column Q and say insert to insert a new column. And I'm going to write in this column concern question mark. All right. You can, the equation we're about to write, I could do the exact, like write the exact same question and write it straight into the working tab. There's no problem with that. It can read across tabs and it wouldn't be like a VLOOKUP. It's just like literally pulling in information from another tab. But I just thought it would be easier to kind of see what's happening. So for the purposes of this example, I'm doing it here. When I ever do like adding an equation in a raw data tab, I would recommend highlighting it. So I'm gonna make it blue and I'm gonna put the borders in just so that it really stands out and I know that that's not part of my raw data set because I really don't want to touch the original numbers. Okay. And now I want it to read, for example, in this column, and I want to just know how many, like if there was a concern or how many concerns in any category. I don't care which one. I want to know how many concerns are there. So I am going to, in cell Q2, put an equal sign and then write count if. And I'm going to just double click there. And now it says range. Where do you want me to look? So the cool thing about the count if equation, let's say you wanted to know how many concerns, like with all of your clients in any section, you could create this equation, you know, maybe at the very bottom or off to the right or something like that. And your range could be a whole section. In this case, I want to know client by client how many concerns there are. So I'm just going to select as my range R2 to V2. And you'll see that I just clicked and dragged, but it did that colon, which in Excel formula speak is 2. So it does R2 through V2. And then I put a comma. And now it asks me for my criteria. Okay, I'm going to count where you told me to, but what do you want me to count? And so what I want it to count in this case is where it says concern. So I do a quote, and then I write concern and end quote, and then end it all in a parentheses. Great, I've done that. I'm going to double click in the bottom right like we have been, and it'll fill it into the bottom. And now I can see the number of concerns there. So this is good for just like kind of quickly counting numbers. You'll see that we're going to build pivot tables in a minute. And I would say that this pivot tables are more flexible in counting really quickly. So I recommend, you know, in many cases using pivot tables, but sometimes you just want to like quickly count something in a piece of data. There's also different count options like count blank. And so sometimes for data quality, checking to see if there's any missing data, I'll at the beginning, or sorry, at the end of a column, write count blank and then select the range, and then I can see how many birth dates are missing or how many, you know, to quickly be able to kind of fill in data. The other thing to mention here, I notice in this data set that there are concerns, but there are also delays. So I could do count if concern, and then I can just do plus count if. You don't have to follow along on this one. I'm just going to do it quickly, but oops. I could add that in as well. You can like build the count if. So maybe you want to know like the number of mothers and fathers and, you know, grandparents, because that's your category that you call caregiver. So just want to note that you can do that as well. Oh, I did something. Oh, I didn't put the T in count. So anyway, just a note there. Yeah. And you'll see that like in this one, there was a concern and a delay, and we have now a number 2. So, all right, any questions there? If not, we will go on to our break. All right. Yeah, we'll see you back at a minute past 2. I'll do 2:02 because it's probably mostly past 1:56. So now is, I think I already said that it's the fun part at VLOOKUP. So now is another fun part, which is digging into pivot tables. And I think, yeah, as I hope you will see, they can be really helpful for quickly looking at data in different ways, to kind of take these long lists of things and be able to kind of quickly reference and consolidate and summarize and analyze the data that you have. So if we navigate over to the pivot tables tab that we have, the light blue one, this is something that I often actually do before creating pivot tables, is put these headers in. So I did it now just to kind of save us time, but I would say that I also do this again in my own practice many times. And essentially what these do is indicate what information I'm interested in seeing. It's really a lot easier than when you're coming back. It's clean to come back and look for or easily reference the data you're looking for. I often color code them in some sort of way. And as you'll see in this case, I have kind of a primary header, which is caseload, and then under that, kind of the specifics as I start building my pivot tables. All right, so we're just going to dive in and create a pivot table, and then kind of with each one talk about a different element of how you can use pivot tables. So first of all, I am going to click in the cell where I want to start building my pivot table. I'm going to just choose B7. I often do choose a cell that gives me a little bit of room above it, because if we start putting in filters, if they hit up against other content, you'll start getting an error message. So I give myself a little wiggle room above and to the right. But yeah, I think B7 will give us plenty of room. And then I am going to go into the insert ribbon and hit pivot table. All right, so automatically it says, okay, choose where you want to put the pivot table, and it already has selected the option of existing sheet and the location of the cell that I had selected. I can change that if I want to. I can also click over to new worksheet if I wanted to, and it would create the pivot table on a completely new worksheet. The next thing I want to look at on this is like, okay, I know where it's going to go, but where is it getting the data? So it says select a table or range, choose the data that you want to analyze. So I'm going to click where it says select table or range. And then I'll put my cursor in that table or range box. And it does have an option for an external data source. I don't recommend doing that very often. Like, I really try to bring my data all into the same place, because if you were to use a different source and then that source got renamed or moved into a different folder or something like that, you end up with a lot of kind of issues. So I try to pull data in just from the same workbook that I'm working in. But I'm going to, in this case, go over to that working tab where we were just working. So again, I have my cursor here in table or range, and then I'm clicking that green tab that says working. And just by clicking the tab, it actually writes that in for me, working. And now I'm going to select the columns that I want to bring in. With the amount of data that we're working with, my practice is always selecting all of the columns, because even if I'm only working in this specific pivot table with columns A through D. In my next pivot table, you know, I might use column M, or I might want to make an adjustment later. So I just always bring in all the columns. So I'm going to click and drag starting with column A. And I'm going to drag over to column Z. Oh, actually X, but feel free to go to Z. And great, so I have that and I can just click OK. All right, so now we have our pivot table. We haven't pulled any data into it yet, but all of it is there. All of the data is there. If I click off of the pivot table, you'll notice that I have my normal ribbons and I don't see anywhere that I can edit my pivot table. But if I click into this box that says pivot table, I get a few different things that are worth noting. First of all, I have 2 additional data ribbons here at the top. So one says pivot table analyze and one says design. And we can look at that a bit more in a minute. And maybe most importantly, what we're going to be using now is this pivot table fields menu that comes up on the right-hand side. If it doesn't come up for whatever reason for you, you can go to that pivot table analyze ribbon and click field list, and it should show up for you. All right, so first I am going to start bringing in data. So you'll notice that at this box at the top, all of these are the column headers. So whatever we wrote in those column headers is what you'll see here. So I'm going to, in this case, our first pivot table is looking at the relationships. So how many mothers, fathers, grandparents, that relationship column. So I'm going to actually just click and drag the word relationship down to rows. So great, now I see this, what I know from just doing that, I don't know how many of each, but I do know the categories that are in my relationship column. I know that there are no aunts or uncles, I know, right? I know that there's just these 4 categories. And now I actually want to bring in the quantity, how many of these relationship categories. So you'll notice that we have, you know, the rows and columns, boxes, that's probably pretty self-explanatory. And then I have the values box. So in this case, I want to bring in something that it's going to count. And I usually use, just like I was talking about the Vlookup, that like individual ID so that it's one for each. That's the value that I'll choose to use for values as well. So I'm going to click and drag where it says individual ID, and I'm going to bring that down into values. So we did indeed get values, but we got very, very large values, which I am sure, looking at our data set, don't make any sense. But if I look at this values box down here, I see that it says sum of individual ID, and that is why. It's not the numbers I was expecting. I just want to know how many children. I don't want them to sum up the individual ID. So if I click this little, where it says sum of individual ID, there's a little drop down option, it's a little caret. And when I click that, I have an option that says value field settings. So I'm going to click on that. And now I have several different options with how it's going to handle the number that is individual ID. In this case, we want just the count, how many. In this case, it wouldn't make sense to say like the average or anything like that, right? We just want to know how many. So I change it to count, and then I say okay. And there we are. We've made a pivot table that's helpful. So that quickly, you know, I could have written 4 different count if equations, right? Someone asked the other day, like, why would you use this versus count if? And it's a good question. I think this is just a lot more flexible and a lot quicker. We would have had to write 4 equations, 1 count if child, 1 count if father, right? So I think this is quite a bit easier. You'll also notice that it's showing blank because when we brought the data in, I selected the whole columns, but there were no individual IDs in those blank columns, so it's not showing any values there. But maybe that's just kind of messy. We don't want that in there. So you can click this little caret here in the pivot table. And just like on our spreadsheet, when we see filters, you can just click blank to unselect it and say, okay. And now our pivot table is a bit cleaner. All right. Any questions there? I want to make sure that everyone was able to make a pivot table. We're going to keep working on a lot of different things that you can do with the pivot tables now, but okay. All right, so something that I do often is you could do that same process again, right? Where we click a cell and you go to insert and pivot table and you select the source data. But since we've already made one and we're going to keep making pivot tables with that same source data, something that I always do, and another reason that I bring in all the data, is I just actually select where the pivot table is and say Control C. And then I'm going to go over, in this case, to the under demographics, child, male, female. I'm going to click where I want it to land and say Control V, and I paste it. And now I have the pivot table with all of that information that we already pulled in for the first one, ready for me to use for the second one. And now I'm going to cater it to what I want to look at now, which is I just want to see children, and I want to see the male-female breakdown. So I am going to first pull down into the rows, the gender column. So I literally am going to click gender and drag it down beneath relationship. And currently what that does for me is I now get to see the relationship, and then each relationship further broken down into male, female. And you'll see that there's little like plus and minuses, so it can, you know, hide the gender breakdown or expand, and you can see that. But in this case, I don't want all this noise on my pivot table. I just really want to see children. So I'm actually going to pull the relationship row up into filters. So now I have the relationship column under filters. I have the gender column under rows, and then ID and values. And I'm going to select this little filter that I have and see currently what's selected is everything except for blank. And I'm going to deselect all of them except for child. I'll leave child, and I'm going to say okay. And now I have, you can see my filter here, relationship is child, and I have the gender breakdown there. All right. I want to show you, I'm going to, we're going to make the pivot table kind of starting from scratch one more time. And the reason for that is often in data you're looking for, you may want to not see each individual, or you may want to see things by, for example, family. That's something that I've run into a lot when using data. So there is that case ID that, as we looked at before, is replicated. So there might be 3 people that have the same case ID because it's like, you know, the 2 children and the father. So I want to be able to look at something that we call count distinct or count unique. I don't just want to see, okay, yeah, there's 84 total clients. I want to see how many unique or distinct case IDs there are. And currently, if I go into, you can go into either of these pivot tables and go to our values section, and I click this little drop down that we did before, and I go to value field settings as we did before. I see that there are a lot of different options. I chose count. I see average, min, max, sum, but I don't see anything that says I just want to count the unique ones. I want to count the distinct ones. So there is a way of creating a pivot table so that there is that option. And I want to show that to you because I think that it's helpful for the data that we often come in contact with. All right, so I'm going to just close this out. So again, I'm going to go under the caseload families header, and I'm going to go to insert, pivot table. This is good practice anyways. I'm going to go to select table or range and select that radio button, and then put my cursor in the box that shows up for me. And now my table range again is going to be on the working tab. So I'll click over to the green working tab. And once again, starting with column A, I'm going to select column A and go all the way over to the end to X. All right, but before you push OK, there is this checkbox down at the bottom that says, add this data to the data model. And I want to select that because what that will do is when we're making our pivot table and we're going to that value field settings, I'll have an additional option that is count distinct. And to count information according to families rather than individuals, when those case IDs or family IDs replicate, I will need that count distinct option. All right, so we have our tables, our data range selected, where we want it to go, and then I have this box at the bottom selected which says add this data to the data model. And then I'm going to press OK. All right, that took a second longer to get, probably because of that data model aspect, but we did get the pivot table in here. And I am going to pull in, instead of individual ID, I'm going to click and drag case ID and bring that into the values section. And it did the same thing that we experienced with individual IDs where it automatically chose to sum the case IDs. But this time we'll go back in again to where it says sum of case ID and go to value field settings. And if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that distinct count comes in. If I were just to do count, just to show you really quick, it says 84 because it's like how many people have case IDs? Well, there's 84. But if I go to that same place, the drop down value field settings, and I choose count distinct, you'll see it changes to 34, which is a very different number, and that gives us our number of families or unique case IDs. All right, we have two more pivot tables that I want to make. So again, doing the process we did before, I'm going to just copy and paste our original, because we don't need that. We're not going to be working with families anymore. I'm going to just copy and paste that original pivot table into under our next heading. And now it is this one we want to look at by relationship and race ethnicity. So now we're going to make use of our rows and our columns. So you can go ahead and pull down where it says BSK race ethnicity. Click that and drag that down under rows. And we'll see again, we have our, you can also change the order. So if I literally just drag relationship under race ethnicity, I would change the order. So now I look, and in my primary headings here are race ethnicity, and then I have that broken down by relationship, just to kind of see how you can play around with it pretty easily. But for this pivot table, what I want to do is actually click and drag relationship up into columns. And so now I can see really quickly the breakdown, right? I have 37 children. I can see really quickly that 15 are white. I have 32 mothers and 9 are Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And I also get the grand totals. So 21 clients are Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin. And that can be interesting. Maybe you want to see those round numbers, but what if you want to see this by percentages? Like I want to know what percentage of our fathers are. So I'm going to right click in the pivot table in those values, and you'll see that there is a menu that says show values as, and there are like a bazillion options. In this case, maybe I'm interested in seeing, again, the question I asked before, what percentage of fathers are white? So I'm actually going to do percentage of column total. So of the 100% going this direction. And now you'll see that my values have switched from those kind of raw numbers to percentages. So I can see really quickly that 50% of the fathers are white. And maybe I don't like how busy it looks because there are 2 decimal points after every number. So if you just click and drag over these values, you can actually adjust the number of decimal points that appear by using this menu here at the top. So I'm going to just click twice over, and I was able to get rid of the additional decimal points. I'm now going to copy and paste this same pivot table right below it. So Control C and Control V, paste it below it. Because maybe I still want to see, like, the percentages are helpful for me understanding, but I'm still curious about kind of the raw numbers. So in this case, I'm going to right click on the values again and say show values as no calculation, so that I can see it that way as well. And maybe in this case, I'm not interested in seeing relationships. So I can just unclick relationship up here in this top part, or I can, from where it says relationship down below under columns, I can click the arrow there and just say remove field. I'm also just going to take out where it says blank. So again, using the filter on the pivot table itself. Scroll down to the bottom and undo. Then we have one more to make. And again, all of these are also on the pivot tables example page if you do want to look at them further in the future. So again, the same process, I'm going to copy and paste whatever pivot table over to this last header. And in this case, it says average monthly income. So first of all, for average monthly income, I probably don't want children. So I'm going to pull relationship into the filters. And I'm going to select there and make sure child is not selected. The second thing I'm going to do is remove race and ethnicity. I'm going to do that just by clicking here. So now I know that I have 47 caregivers, but I'm actually interested in seeing income levels. So I'll go here. There's an option that says average monthly income total. So I'm going to click and drag that into rows. And I have all of the income levels and then the number of individuals that fall into that total income. So for example, there are 2 caregivers that have the total monthly income of $2,000. So that's kind of how to read this. Count of individual ID is this column. And that might be interesting to have that much specificity, but you probably could have just like sorted your raw data, right? Like what pivot tables are helpful for is starting to like look at trends and categorize. And these are too many categories. So a really cool option that pivot tables have for numbers is actually doing that in the pivot table, is pulling together categories of values. So if I right click anywhere in those numbers, I can select the option that says group. Unfortunately, you can't choose exactly what your categories are. Like I couldn't do 0 to 1,000 and then 1,000 to 5,000. You have to choose something that's more systematic. So in this case, I'm going to say starting at 0 and then ending at 15,000. And I want the steps to be by 3,000. Right? So I want it to 0 to 3,000, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, like that. And then I'm going to say, okay. And now it has rolled all of those values up into these categories that are easier to read and probably easier to use. So a couple of other things I wanted to show you here is, first of all, if I right click, I can also ungroup, because you might not want those forever. You can also click on where it says grand total and say remove grand total, because that was just adding these all together and maybe I didn't want that. And then the last little thing I wanted to show you is if I click on where it says count of individual ID, let's say that I specifically, there is, I don't know, a specific opportunity that is available for any client whose income is under $3,000 a month or something like that. So I'm interested in kind of isolating who these people are specifically. So I could click on where it says the count of ID, and I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to say show details. And it actually opens up an additional tab automatically that pulls in all of those clients that fall under that, whatever that criteria was, into its own spreadsheet, into a table. So I just wanted to show you that because I think it's useful. But for this, for now, I'm going to right click that sheet and just delete it. And we have now completed our set of pivot tables. I guess just to give kind of big picture information, the design is really nice to use. It's really quickly being able to make it look different, right? So just, you know, clicking this drop down here, I can instantly make it, you know, green in a specific format. So that's really nice. Pivot table analyze, another thing that I would like to point out is it's best practice before you're ever going to kind of count on your pivot table values is to go up to the top and click refresh all. Because if you've changed any of your original data, like you sent it to that colleague of yours and they changed the birth date and sent it back, unless you say refresh these pivot tables, it may not be refreshed, and so it won't take in the new information. So I just always refresh it. All right. So the last, or I guess, yeah, any questions? I don't know, Audrey, if any questions have come in that I need to answer about pivot tables before jumping.
I don't think so, unless anyone has not chatted and wants to ask a question now, feel free, but so far it seems like we're following.
Okay. All right. So this is obviously, I think, a helpful visual way to see it, but there's still other ways that can be more helpful. And so often, one of those ways can be a dashboard. So this dashboard that we made as an example is literally using only the information on the pivot tables that we just made, and just a way to easily visually represent the data that we're looking at. The other cool thing, right, is that a lot of this information is directly connected to the pivot tables. So you don't have to actually alter anything. Literally, by if you're changing anything in your data set and then you just push refresh on the pivot tables, all of these visuals will also change automatically. So that's really cool. So I'm going to click over to the dashboard that we're creating here. And I just want to do a couple of quick notes about formatting, and then we'll get more into the content. So I did kind of some of the initial formatting, but feel free to change this background color and text. Also, there's these headers that you can change. So I'm just clicking around here in this home ribbon tab, put the paint bucket, fills in the background, and then adjusting the text and making it bold. Once you've selected something that you like, Again, for consistency's sake and just to make it faster, I often use the format painter. If I just click it once, so I like, let's say I like this format. If I just click it once while it's selected and then click down here, it'll copy that format, but then the format painter goes away. If I double click the format painter and then go to all of my titles and click through, you'll see that it actually, the paintbrush stays with my cursor. So I don't have to redo that every time. That's something that I use sometimes. And then if you want to get rid of it, you can either click on Format Painter or just click Escape, and it gets rid of the paintbrush. Another thing that I often use, especially on dashboards, is merging and centering my titles. So here where it says relationship by race, ethnicity, you'll see that it's only going over into 2 cells. So I'm going to actually select all 4, click merge and center twice, and it should pull it across. So yeah, feel free to use whatever colors you'd like. I'm going to change a couple of things here. All right. So another thing, I often keep the grid line on at the beginning while I'm building a dashboard because it's easier to see how things are aligned. But obviously at the end, it's nicer to not have that grid in the background. So if you go to view grid lines, you can get rid of them. I'm going to keep them for now while we build this together. And the last thing I wanted to note kind of on in the realm of general formatting is about printing, because I know that can be a real headache, printing from Excel. So what I do is I will select the area that I want to print, and hopefully I'll build it so that it's looks like about a page. And then I'll go to File, Print. This is how I can kind of see how it'll print out. And then there are several options that I always will select. The first one is fit on one page. I don't want it to be going to multiple pages. And then narrow margins. I kind of build in my margins already, so narrow margins. And then this one at the top that says that currently print active sheets, and I want to print selection. So just what I had selected there. And now it looks, yeah, like pretty good. All right. You can also do other things. If you notice here at the bottom, there's like a grid, it's normal. And if I click to page layout, which is the second option, I can actually add in a header and a footer. All right, I'm going to go back to normal. Okay, so first I want to start bringing in some data. And I love this part because it's very easy and Excel is really smart. It writes the equation for me. So if I click, I know I have a pivot table that says the number of mother, father, grandparent, children. So I'm going to click where it says mother and put an equal sign. And I want it to equal whatever is on the pivot table. So again, you could just like write the value that you found in your pivot table. But if I want this to auto update, I want to connect the graphs and information I'm bringing to the pivot table. So equals, then I'm going to go over to my pivot table, and where it says mother, I'm going to click there. You'll notice that what it did for me automatically without me doing anything is it didn't just say equals C11. It actually wrote out an equation for me. So if I were to ever in my original data set add relationship categories like cousin, aunt, uncle, whatever, it's still, for this value, going to look in this pivot table, look for where relationship is mother. So it's okay if it moves around. It's going to read that specific category, mother. And then you can just do the same thing for mother, father, grandparent. Equals, going down to over to my pivot tables, click on the value, enter, grandparent. And children equals. Go over to my pivot tables, child, enter. Awesome. I am then caregivers here. I'm just going to say equals sum, and it'll be the sum of the 3 cells below it. So I'm just going to click and drag on those and close my parentheses. And maybe I want these to be bold. And then total clients, I'm going to do equals, and it's going to be caregivers plus children. And these will also auto update because they're all based on the original data as the pivot table data. So yeah, feel free to do any formatting along the way. And then I'm going to also just take in these yellow, take the yellow off. So the fill color, I'm going to go to no fill. All right. Cool. So we've brought our data in from our pivot table, and these, I put little notes in here about one potential graph option you could make. So pie graph of clients. Cool. So I'm going to take off that note for myself. And I'm going to select the data that I want to turn into a graph. So in this case, I want mother, father, grandparent, child, and their corresponding values. Then I'm going to go up to insert. And you'll see in the middle, there's a section that says chart. And I see there's a little image of a pie or donut chart. I'm going to click there. And it gives me different kinds of pie charts. And I'm going to choose just our standard pie. And now I can just click and move that around a little bit. I'm going to resize it so that it's just right by my data. All right, so I have successfully pulled in the data into a chart that easily. And you'll notice that I get a couple new tabs that show up for me. One that says chart design and one that says format. I want to quickly just note, and this is true in everywhere in Excel, there's often, right, so many different ways to do the same thing. So, for example, when you make a chart, there's a little plus sign that says chart elements, then there's chart styles, and then you have your chart filters. Up here, you also have chart element. You have a bunch of different style items that you can use, and there's also a format option here. So that's just always true. So first, I'm going to go to chart design, and I'm going to just change my color scheme. If you click from the middle section, they actually give you a lot of kind of different like templates, but I'm going to go to change colors, and I'm going to choose a monochromatic scheme. It's orange. And then I am going to start playing with the different elements. So if I click the plus here, you'll see that it gives me kind of the elements that are available in this specific type of chart. So I'm going to unclick chart title because maybe I don't want that. If I want it again, I can click it again. And I can click this little arrow beside it, and it'll ask me above chart, center chart, or more options. If you click more options, and this is where I often do a lot of my formatting actually, is this help menu that comes on the right-hand side. And I mean, you can just delve into everything about it, right? I'm looking just at format chart title, and I can look at the fill. I want a gradient in the back. I want a picture in the back, right? There's just a bazillion options, no fill. Border, the same thing. And there's even different tabs in this. So here I have, if I want to do a shadow or a glow, I don't really use the hectagon one very often. And then the last one is size and properties. So there's literally an infinite amount of things that you can do. I also have my text options there. But for now, for this specific chart, I usually my best practice in kind of data visualization is like, you want to give enough information that it's understandable and highlight information that they're trying to get across. But you don't want to add in extra information. So I often, like in this case, we have our title already over here. I'm not going to duplicate that. So I'm going to take the title off. I'm going to also the legend. Let's go for more options for the legend. So I clicked the plus legend, and I'm going to put my legend on the right-hand side. I'm going to go to the Format tab, Shape Outline, No Outline. I'm just showing you different places to do the same kind of editing stuff. And data labels. I'm going to do the plus sign again and data labels. And if I click that and say more options, you can say outside end, inside end, right? Just an infinite amount of ways to play around with that. All right. Okay, so yeah, basically the game of making visuals is a game of playing around with options, but why don't we dig into this next chart? So in our example, you'll see that there's very little labeling here, but it's just to kind of give a data bar that's coming off of the data. So I can quickly visually see how, in this example, the ratio of male to female. So I'm going to go back to my dashboard and take that node off. And then first, again, bringing in information from the pivot tables in the same way we did. Equals, and then in this pivot table, child, male, female, I'm going to choose male and say enter, and then female equals, go to that pivot table that says female, enter. And I'm going to take out the background color. All right, and so this time I'm going to select this data, which is what I want to use to make my chart. I'm going to go to insert, and this time I'm going to choose a bar chart. You'll notice again, there's a lot of different kinds. I'm going to choose the 2D. And I'm going to hit this chart title, and I'm going to right click and say delete. Again, yet another way to format it. If you right click any element, you'll see that it gives you a bunch of options, including to format it. In this case, I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to resize it. And as I pull it closer to try to, start aligning it with my table, you probably notice that female and male are reversed. Like I want the female to be on the bottom and male to be on top. So if I go up here and under chart design, I have an option that says select data. And I'm going to click that. Select data always kind of brings you back to looking at, where is this table or where is this graphic drawing the data from? How is it being organized? You can even use this as a filter. So I could go to select data and I'm like, I actually don't want to include the data bar for female, and I could do that. It would hide it. In this case, I want them to switch orders. Under the series, you actually have the option to change the order in which the series is, but you don't have that option under these horizontal categories. So I'm actually going to click this button up top, which says switch row and column. And I still currently have female on top and male below, but now I have the option, if I click male or female, I can remove the element, but I also can just change the order and click move down. So I'm just going to select male and then click this arrow that says move down, and it changes the order for me. And I'm now going to say okay. I'm going to take off the vertical axis category by literally just clicking it and then backspace. maybe I want to click on this bar, colors. And I'm going to, you'll see this time when I do the plus, there's a lot more options because a bar graph just has more different things that you can add in. I am going to say format plot area. And as I click around, you'll notice I started with plot area, and as I click around on my graph, my formatting options change. So as I click the major grid lines, all of a sudden now I have a bunch of options about adjusting the major grid lines. When I go to the click on the bars, it says format data series, and you'll see that I have the options for gap width and series overlap. So these are now two different series, and I'm going to just actually adjust that to move the bars away from each other a little bit so that I can line it up well with my table. And I go to format up here, and my shape outline, I'm going to say no outline, shape fill, no fill. And then move it right there. All right. So for this next, well, actually, before I start this next one, I guess, is there any kind of pressing question that someone wanted to see about charts and graphs? If not, I'll just keep kind of working through another process.
Abby, just before you continue, I'm just going to offer one more reminder for the evaluation in case any folks have to leave early. So I'm about to drop that back into the chat. If you can open that up and fill it out at your convenience, we would appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super helpful to hear from you, how we can improve these classes for sure. And also, as I'm going to go through the next chart, but if you're having fun and wanting to make your own and play around, please do so. I'm just going to go through one or two more processes. So in this one, we could do the same thing that we did last time, right? Where we say the equal sign, and then, and that's, I would say is best practice, right? Like, so that your charts and tables in your dashboard are always updating based on your pivot tables, which are always being updated based on your original data. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to copy and paste this data in. I also want to show you, so this table is, we have our categories here, which are our race ethnicity categories, and then we have our relationship categories here. As I go over to the pivot tables, first of all, I see that I have child also. So if I don't want child, I'm going to go up to this filter, click child to take the child out of this pivot table and say okay. The other thing, again, is that my order was mother, father, grandparent. And this is father, grandparent, mother. So that wouldn't work for copying and pasting. So I'm going to select this column where it says mother. So if I go up to the top where it says mother, it will shift to a black arrow. And if I click that, I've then selected that column. I'm then going to go to the far left side of it, and my cross turns from a white cross to this kind of black cross. And I'm going to click and drag it. And you'll see that it kind of you can see where you're dragging the column. I'm going to drag it to the beginning and drop it. That's a useful tip just when dealing with pivot tables. Sometimes it'll automatically come into an order that's not the order you want it to be in. Maybe other is in the middle because it's alphabetically in the middle, but you want other to be at the very bottom of your pivot table or stuff like that. So again, you can always just select your column or row, go to that black cross and drag the order. So just a note there. But for now, what we're doing is we are selecting the data and we're copying and pasting it into our source or into our dashboard. So I'm going to copy and paste these percentages. I'll select here, mother, father, grandparent, all the different race ethnicity categories, Control C, and then navigate over to the dashboard again. And starting here, I'm actually going to right click and say paste values. And what that does is it just pastes the values, the information. If this, for example, were an equation and I didn't want all the equation underneath, I just wanted what's on top. I just want the values that show up. That's what it does. So it doesn't take the formatting or anything like that. It just pastes the values. So I'm going to paste the values in here. Great. And the next thing I did is, okay, those are the percentages, but just like when we were looking at the pivot tables, maybe I want the percentages here, but now coming off of this, I want actually the kind of raw values. So, you know, I can see the percentages and also how many, for example, total caregivers are in the category of American Indian Alaska Native. So to do that, I again am going to use my pivot tables. So I'm going to navigate over to my pivot tables. I want to make sure that I don't have any children in this category. So I need to pull in relationship to the filter and say select multiple items, deselect children and child and deselect blank. And then I have OK. So now it's ready. This data matches exactly this data, so I can use it as my raw numbers. I'm good there. So I'm going to go to, this time, because I want it to show up here, but I want my data to be somewhere else, I'm going to say insert. And then I'm going to go to, I want a bar graph, and I want it to be the same kind that we did before. And now I can tell it, again, this, you can do this in either order, but I wanted the graph itself to show up on this page. So now I have the graph, but I don't have any data in it. So I'm going to go under chart design to select data. And it says chart data range. Where do you want me to grab this from? I'm going to go over to the pivot tables. And I want it to show up here. And it really quickly shows you what information it's bringing in. Yep, it looks like it's bringing in all the information I want it to. I don't want to pull in grand total. Then I can say OK. You'll see that because I'm pulling this directly from a pivot table, there are a lot of, they actually bring in those same kind of pivot table filters. So I directly in here could add child back in if I wanted to, for example. I'll take it off. Okay. For our purposes, though, I want to remove these. Oh. Sorry, going crazy. Maybe I want to remove the total. So I can, by removing, I right click and then I just can say hide in whatever things I want to hide. So I want to hide the all fields buttons on chart. Okay. So I just hid those buttons, but it's kind of cool to know that if you are building a graph directly from a pivot table, that might be a fun thing to play around with as well. You can have those filters built into it and play around with those on the graph, and it'll kind of real time shift the graphic around for you. In this case, you know, we would again, let's see, we'll try to play with different things. I can delete these, but if I click on the bars, I'm gonna again change the colors, and I can put in data labels if I want. So I'm going to click data labels, more options, and I can adjust, you know, their colors or have little boxes, anything like that. And maybe I'll make these bold. I maybe don't want such a far gap between all of them, so I can shift this. Yeah. Possibilities are endless. So I know I didn't get through all of the charts, and again, I didn't really expect to, but I just wanted to show you briefly the other charts that we made on this one in case you want to do them in the future. I really like using these 100% stacked bars. You can also put data labels in them if you wish. But what that does is it allows you to see kind of another dimension of information. So it's like within this relationship category, what's the breakdown of race, ethnicity, and you can see it better comparatively. So that's just a type of graph that I tend to use quite often. I wanted to note that. You can also really quickly kind of switch between different graph types to play with them and see what you like best. So if you were to click a graph and go to chart design and go to change chart type, all it would take literally is clicking change chart type and then clicking on a different chart type, and you'd be able to see that just as you're kind of exploring what the best way to demonstrate your data is in that case. So wanted to note that as well. And yeah, looks like we have just a couple of minutes left. So I think I will hang out here. I'll let you all, if you do need to leave right at 3, leave a couple of minutes for you to fill out the evaluation. If you're able to do that before you sign off, that would be great. And otherwise, I'll hang out for a few minutes and answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. We will follow up probably early next week with the recording of this session in case you'd like to go back and go over anything else that you want to practice. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all. I know it's a lot of Excel, a lot of listening to my voice. And so I appreciate you all being here.